Greetings, this is Greg. 1966 was a very exciting year for muscle cars. A lot happened. For example, this was the first year for the Dodge Charger, shown here. It was also the last year for some of the legendary engines, like Pontiac's 389 and Buick's 401. And it was the last year for the multiple carb setups on the General Motors muscle cars. After 66, the only GM car allowed to have multiple carbs was the Corvette. So, let's jump right in with the description of the cars and then get into the performance data. I'll go over the cars from General Motors first because not too much changed with them from the 1965 models, and I already covered those pretty extensively in the previous video, thus we can move through the GM products pretty quickly. Now before we get started, YouTube's new rules require me to label this video as not for children. So if you are a child, don't watch it. If you are a parent, you're going to have to exercise good judgment about what you allow your children to watch. This video has gambling, drag racing on public roads, generally unsafe driving, gunfire, an evil plot involving kidnapped women, and a scantily clad female dancing in a cage. So the video is for grown-ups. Now to help ensure compliance with the new rules, there will be a form at the end of the video, and if you feel that I went a bit overboard with touchy subjects, you can fill it out and send it in to the appropriate governing agency. Moving along, let's start with Pontiac's GTO. Compared with the 65 model, not much change mechanically. The standard engine is the 335 horsepower 4-barrel carb 389, a 360 horsepower version with the 3 2-barrel setup they called tri-power was an option. The body changed quite a bit, and the interior is beautiful. I really like the 66 GTO, and I think it looks great. It's the last year of the 389 and the last year of the tri-power option. There just isn't much to talk about here that I didn't already cover in the 1965 episode. It still offers a choice of a 2-speed automatic or one of 3 manual transmissions, a 3-speed, a wide ratio 4-speed, and a close ratio 4-speed, as well as a large selection of rear axle ratios. So you could really tailor your GTO to the type of driving you're going to do, whether it be quarter-mile drag racing, road courses, or a day-to-day driver in the city, or long trips on highways. Whatever you wanted to do, you could set up your GTO specifically for it. Now, the 66 GTO looks great. It performs as well as ever, and this just might be my favorite year GTO. No question that the later GTOs were better, but there's something about this body, the interior, and the appeal of tri-power that makes the 66s desirable. The story with the Olds 442 for 66 is much like that of the GTO. New body style, it really stands out. Mechanically, it's much the same as the 65 model. However, for 66, Olds offered tri-power on the 442, giving 360 horsepower, up from the standard 4-barrels 350. The 2-speed in the Olds had the variable pitch torque converter as it did in 1965. Of course, for best performance, a 4-speed was offered, and there were many axle ratios available. The Olds was slightly more expensive than the GTO, as Olds was a slightly more upscale division in the General Motors hierarchy. Now, the Olds did have 2 advantages over the GTO to justify the slightly higher price. First, if equipped with automatics, its variable pitch torque converter gave it the edge over the GTO's more conventional 2-speed. Second, the Olds had a rear anti-sway bar, thus offering slightly better handling. Next up, we have the Buick Grand Sport. This is basically the same car we talked about in the 65 episode, just a better looking body. Mechanically, it's about the same as the 1965 car, although there is a new carburetor option. The standard carb was the Carter AFB 4-barrel, and it had 325 horsepower, 445 pound-feet of torque. The optional Rochester carbed 401 was a bit more powerful. The carb was a bit larger, bumped power up to 340 horsepower. Torque remained the same, but came in slightly later. I have to say I really like the Carter AFB 4-barrel. I do prefer it over the Rochester. Now, the ultimate setup was a dual 4-barrel unit, but those were dealer installed, not offered directly from the factory. And that dual 4-barrel unit had dual Carter AFB 4-barrels. The only automatic was Buick's 2-speed, but it still had the variable pitch torque converter, so that's great. This, combined with the Buick's high torque, made it the quickest of the 2-speed automatic muscle cars. The Buick was a very high quality car. Its Fisher body was probably the best of any 60s American car. It rode on a fully boxed frame sourced from the convertible Skylark, and the interior was very comfortable. This will be the last year for the old Nailhead 401 and for the 2-speed automatic in Buicks. Both perform very well and are rock solid reliable. There was a 4-speed manual available, but most Buick buyers opted for the automatic. Although potential power via hot rodding the 401 is not comparable to the other engines here, stock out of the box, the Buick is right there with them. The big news in the GM stable is Chevrolet's new Chevelle SS396. New body style, it looks good, and the 396 is one of the best muscle car engines of the 60s. Maybe the best. Now the Chrysler 426 Hemi might have something to say about that, but a significant difference is that the Chevelle 396 was commonly available. Not only in Chevelles, you could get a 396 in just about anything, and it was a low-cost option, and there were a lot of them. The Chrysler 426 Street Hemi was really a very rare engine. Now, you may recall in the previous year, you could get a 396 in a Chevelle, but it was a low-production, very expensive car. Only about 200 of the 1965 Z16 Chevelles, that's the one with the 396, and only about 200 of those were built. Thus, it wasn't something the Chevrolet dealers could really offer to people that were cross-shopping Chevelles with GTOs. As with the other GMA bodies we've discussed so far, the 66 Chevelle was restyled. The SS396 option was not a high-cost option. It didn't have the fully boxed frame we saw on the Z16 from the previous year, but it did have some frame strengthening, as well as the usual muscle car recipe of upgraded suspension and brake components, as well as some visual cues to let people know this was the muscle car version of the Chevelle. I should mention that the term muscle car wasn't really in use yet. People were calling these things supercars, which shows how much terminology has changed over the years, since supercar means something totally different today. Now, the big news was under the hood. Chevelle's 396, with its excellent breathing and durability, was a major force to be reckoned with. In standard form, it put out 325 horsepower, 360 horsepower variants, and a 375 horsepower variant were optional. Now, the two lower variants, the 325 and 360 horsepower, both had 10 1/4 to 1 compression. They were commonly available, and they would run just fine on any premium fuel. The 375 horsepower version, which was called the L78, featured 11 to 1 compression, so it's a little bit more sensitive to fuel. It had forged steel rods, a Holley carb, and more. Now, this exact same engine had been rated at 425 horsepower in other applications, so many feel that the 375 gross horsepower rating was intentionally low. Low either to avoid in-house competition with the 427, and I think that explanation is likely, or for insurance purposes. In any case, I don't think there's any doubt that the L78 put out more than the 375 claimed horsepower. However, relatively few people ordered the L78 Chevelles, relatively few in Chevrolet terms, which still is a lot of cars. Now, first of all, there was no mention of these in brochures or dealer sales literature. In fact, there was no mention of them at all in the first few months of the year. Thus, dealers generally didn't order them. If you wanted one, you had to know it existed and explain that to a cooperative dealer to get them to order it. When Chevrolet did get around to sending the dealers official information on it, they said it was for off-road use. Thus, the vast majority of SS396s were either the 325 or 360 horsepower versions. Still, they sold about 3,000 L78 Chevelles in spite of themselves, but that was a small percentage of the total. I probably would have bought the 360 horsepower version myself. Due to traction limitations on street tires, it's about equal to the more powerful variant in most real-world street situations, and with 10 1/4 to 1 compression, fuel octane would be less critical. Plus, I'm not a big fan of the Holley carb on a street car, and the 360 horsepower version's hydraulic lifters are essentially maintenance free once they're set up. The 375 horsepower motor is certainly streetable. I'm not saying it's not hating on it. It's just that it's a little bit closer to a racing engine. In 1966, Ford finally shows up to the muscle car party. You may remember from earlier episodes in this series that in 1964 and 65, Ford didn't really have an answer for Pontiac's GTO. In 1965, you could buy a Mustang, a Falcon, or a Fairlane with a 271 horsepower 289, and if optioned with a 4-speed and a performance axle ratio, all of these cars perform pretty well. However, in terms of straight line speed, none could really keep up with the GTO, at least not a 4-speed GTO with typical gearing. A 289 Mustang couldn't really keep up with a hot 327 powered Chevy 2, let alone any of the big block muscle cars from GM, so something had to be done. Plus, the Mustang and Falcon were much smaller than the intermediate-based muscle cars like the Chevelle, and the 289 Fairlane was just too far behind in performance. Now, Ford did offer a non-street version of the Fairlane in these previous years called the Thunderbolt, but that was a factory race car, certainly not something that would be cross-shopped with a streetable muscle car. The bottom line was that Ford needed an intermediate-based big block muscle car. For 1966, Ford brought out the newly restyled Fairlane. It's styled to look something like a scaled-down Ford Galaxy. It's similar in size to the GM muscle cars, and in all respects was a decent vehicle. The muscle car variants were the Fairlane GT, which used the manual transmission, and the Fairlane GTA, which used an automatic. The engine used in Ford's new muscle car was the big block 390 cubic inch V8. But not just any V8, they used the top version often used in police cars. This was a powerful version and heavy duty so that it could maintain pursuits through the desert all day long. Good engine. It had 10 1/2 to 1 compression, a 4-barrel carb, and dual exhaust, giving it 335 horsepower and 427 pound-feet of torque. That's a decent amount of power. It's not enough to make it the most powerful muscle car on the road, but it's about equal to the 4-barreled carbed GM muscle cars and the 383 powered Dodges and Plymouths. Ford added trim, badging, and interior changes to distinguish it from lesser variants. I think the Fairlane GT and GTA look really good, and of course they also upgraded the suspension via normal muscle car techniques, stiffer spring shocks, and a decent front anti-sway bar. Now, the big advantage the Fairlane GTA had over its GM competitors was Ford's new automatic transmission called the C6. The C6 was a 3-speed. It was rugged and it shifted fast. Furthermore, it could be manually controlled. For example, if you selected second gear from a standstill, the car would actually start out in second, unlike the 3-speeds from GM or Chrysler, which would not let you do that. And of course, the only 3-speeds in GM cars were in larger cars, not intermediates. So the C6 was a bit more like a manual than the other 3-speeds on the market, but still retained all the advantages of an automatic. Thus, the Fairlane GTA with its 3-speed automatic could outperform the GM 2-speed cars. And since many buyers preferred automatics, this gave the new muscle car from Ford an important advantage over the automatic transmission muscle cars from Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick. Now, over at Ford's Mercury division, they offered a more slightly upscale car, which was the Comet Cyclone GT and GTA. These were essentially clones of the Fairlane muscle cars, but were just nicer and slightly more expensive. The Cyclones are some of the nicest muscle cars from the 60s, but are at least somewhat forgotten. Looking back, it's clear that Mercury couldn't figure out if they wanted to advertise the car to older people or, as seen here, to the younger crowd. Both the Fairlane GTA and Cyclone GTA could run low 15s in the quarter mile and a bit faster with the 4-speeds. I'll put up detailed performance information with the other 66 cars later in this video. It should be noted there was a 427 cubic inch Fairlane in 1966, but these were unobtainable. I feel I have to mention them because, as it is, Ford people are going to mention that I should have talked about them more in the comments. But here's the reality. Only 57 of these cars were built. It was a $1,700 option on a $2,400 car. They're not mentioned in any of the sales brochures of the day. They did exist, just not as a car anyone could run down to the dealer and buy. And those who did probably didn't intend to daily drive them. They're sort of analogous to Chrysler's race Hemi, not street Hemi. Meaning, yes, you could get them and you could put a license plate on them, which you could put a license plate on anything back then. But few people would daily drive one, and with only 57 being built, John Smith from down the street could not get one. You had to be somebody at Ford, or you had to know somebody there. Now, speaking of the Hemi, we have big news over at the Dodge and Plymouth divisions. For 1966, they have finally unveiled a street version of the 426 Hemi. It's very similar to the race Hemi, but with lower compression and a more mild camshaft, and an inline versus cross-ram dual 4-barrel carb setup. The Hemi was rated at 425 gross horsepower, which was probably about right. There's a lot of debate about that. It was a beautifully made engine, powerful, and although they have a reputation for being finicky, the truth is they were quite reliable. The downside is that it was an expensive option. The engine added between $800 and $1,000 to the price of the car, depending on the model of car we're talking about. Now, in fairness, that extra money went towards more than just the engine. They upgraded a lot of other stuff when you selected the Hemi option. Now, that said, it did make the muscle cars intermediates from Chrysler the fastest of the 66 street muscle cars. But a much more common choice was the 325 horsepower 383. That was no slouch, but not quite enough to keep up with the hottest variants of the GMA bodies. However, when paired with automatics, the Dodges and Plymouths enjoyed the advantage of their 3 speeds, which more than leveled the playing field against the A-bodies with their 2 speeds. Let's have a look at the 1966 Dodge Charger. This is the first year of the Charger, and this original Charger body style is often forgotten as the 68 to 1970 models tend to get all the glory. However, in many ways, the original Charger is more special. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I don't think they quite got the body style right. I do like the way it looks, but there's something about it that just seems off to me, like the front doesn't match the back or something. But once we get past that, the rest of the car just screams awesomeness. The interior is beautiful. That full-length center console is fairly unique, and it really stands out. The seats are comfortable, although totally lacking in lateral support. When you corner fast in a 66 Charger, which it could do reasonably well, you spend about as much energy trying to stay in your seat as you do trying to keep the car on the road, and I'm speaking from personal experience here. From a performance standpoint, these are the worst bucket seats of any 60s muscle car. However, they are comfortable. Now, the dash has all the gauges you need, and the tack is up front where you can see it, not buried down on the console as it was in so many of its competitors. The gauges are lighted via electroluminescence. That means they use electricity to glow, and they glow a science fiction looking greenish color. They look amazing. It's really exciting to drive a 66 Charger at night because of the way that dash looks. Sadly, many people don't know how to fix them, so today they usually don't work. As an example, my father, who's passed away a number of years ago, he knew how to fix them, but he was one of the very few people that I knew that did. Now, the rear seats fold down, as does the rear panel that separates the trunk from the passenger compartment. 2 adults can actually sleep in this thing comfortably, so you could go camping or camping. Now, the automatic transmission that comes with this that comes with the 383 was Chrysler's excellent TorqueFlite 727, also available with the Hemi, of course. At full throttle shifts, it's set up to shift at 5,500 RPM, and it shifts hard and fast. So there's no need to manually shift it, although of course you could. Now you could also get a 4-speed manual with the 383 or the Hemi, and with a wide selection of axle ratios. Now the downside of the 66 Charger is the poor build quality, and I hope the Mopar crowd doesn't hate on me too much for saying it, but it's just true. While the engine, transmission, brakes, and suspension are all at least equal to everything from Ford and GM, the rest of the car is way behind in quality. I mean everything. Windshield wipers, window winders, door panels, body quality. Anything that's not directly involved in moving the car down the road was more the quality of a $2,000 European car than a $3,100 American car. Now, if bang for the buck was your concern, for $400 less, you could buy a Dodge Coronet, which compared with the Charger was the same car mechanically. You could also opt for the even less expensive Plymouth Belvedere, or any of the Belvedere variants. All of these cars could be had with the same 383 or 426 Hemi, same transmissions, rear ends, everything. Thus, were performance bargains as compared with the Charger, although with pretty much the same build quality. Now, let's get into performance. This is going to be fun because for 1966, we have a lot of data, as well as some factory cheating and treachery, which makes this even more fun. For this model, Chevrolet prepared a dealer training video that covered all of their models. It's quite entertaining. For the most part, it had a Western movie theme, but the muscle car subplot involved an evil genius who kidnapped women, forcing them to dance in cages. This, of course, requires our hero in a Chevelle SS396 to engage in several performance contests against other muscle cars. None of this makes any sense, I know, but we don't want to let logic get in the way of a hot chick dancing in a cage, and neither did the people who made this video. Next, we see the SS396 line up against a Fairlane GT and a GTO for a quarter-mile and a half-mile drag race. Now, I don't expect a 100% honest race here, but it's a good place to start. I've mentioned before that the options and tires have a larger effect on quarter-mile times for these cars than just about anything else, and we don't know too much about the options. The narration says that all are top performance models. The Chevelle has the 360 horsepower 396. This is mentioned specifically, and you can see it when the hood is open on the car. Of course, we can't be 100% sure it's the same car they used for the drag race, but I think it almost certainly is. All three cars are 4 speeds. We don't know the rear axle ratio, and that's a big factor. I suspect the GTO has tri-power, no way to be sure. If I had to guess, I would say the GTO here has a wide ratio 4-speed and a 355 rear axle ratio. Chevrolet's probably the same. That's how I would have set one up if I was intending to do a half-mile drag race. Now, I think the Ford has a rear axle ratio that puts it at a disadvantage for this test, but that's really just a guess. A 3.25 to 1 ratio was common for the Ford, but they also had a 3.0 and 3.5 to 1 ratio commonly fitted from the factory, and there were other ratios that were optional as well. Now, as the cars leave the line, the Ford falls behind almost immediately. That's not due to power or gearing, that's due to traction. Now, we can't really tell because of the cuts, but it looks like it may have gotten one tire slightly off the edge of the road. At least that's how I see it. Now, the Chevy edges out the GTO by a few tenths of a second, and the Fairlane is a full second behind, more than it would be in any other comparison test of these cars. The Fairlane, in a fair setup, would not win this drag race, but it wouldn't be that much behind either. So, either it was a really bad run for the Fairlane, the test was rigged, or the two GM cars just have much better gear ratios. In other words, they're set up specifically for this event, and the Ford isn't. Still, we can learn a lot by what we don't see here. Chevrolet didn't include a muscle car from Chrysler Corporation in their comparison to the SS396. Yet in this same video, they did include a Plymouth when comparing family station wagons. It's also worth noting that they didn't use automatic transmission cars. If they had the Fairlane GTA, would have enjoyed a pretty big advantage, and it would have won this speed contest in anything approaching fair conditions. Next, we have the big showdown in the car and driver issue from March of 1966. I think this is the greatest magazine road test ever for reasons that will become clear. Let's back up a moment to March of 1964 because we need context for this. Now, this same magazine printed an article in which they claimed that the Pontiac GTO was in many ways a better car than the Ferrari GTO. Yeah, okay, fine. I don't have any problem with that. If you're buying a family car, yeah, the GTO is better. And there are other ways the Pontiac GTO is better than the Ferrari as well. Not in all-out performance, though. But in the magazine, they claimed that the GTO, the Pontiac GTO, did 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds, with the quarter mile in 13.1 at 115 miles an hour. Now, no stock GTO can do that, regardless of gear ratios, carburetor jets, or other normal dealer tuning tricks. This was largely a publicity stunt, as there was no Ferrari GTO in the test, not even any pictures of one, which is why there's a drawing on the cover. It's very likely that Pontiac slipped them a highly modified ringer, or maybe those times were just made up. I don't know. Moving to 1965, Pontiac and Car and Driver do it again. This time, they claimed a 421-powered Pontiac 2+2. That's basically a Pontiac Catalina. And in this case, equipped with a 4-speed and a 342 rear axle ratio, so not even geared for drag racing. They claimed it could do 0 to 60 in 3.9, yes, 3.9 seconds, and beat the Ferrari in the quarter mile. Now that 0 to 60 time was simply impossible, and not by a small margin. They were already getting hate mail from the 1964 issue with the GTOs. Now, as a result of this article, they were receiving hate mail in massive quantities. My father drove on some road tests for magazines in the 1980s, not for this magazine, but through him I did meet a staff member from Car and Driver that told me they were literally receiving hate mail for this 20 years after they wrote the article. Of course, they sold a lot of magazines and advertising space, so they were laughing all the way to the bank. Now, it seems that for 1966, they wanted to turn things around and really keep their comparison on the up and up. But that wasn't easy. They notified the manufacturers that they wanted muscle cars for a comparison test. The test would include drag racing and fast laps at the Bridgehampton racetrack by a world-famous, world-class driver. They wanted stock cars, not modified cars. Any performance-enhancing options would be fine as long as they were options commonly available at the dealer. They also prohibited changing rear axle ratios between the drag strip and the road course. Chrysler declined the invitation. The article includes a quote from a Chrysler representative explaining why, so here it is. Quote, "Whether you guys like it or not, you're running a race involving a bunch of very serious competitors. Frankly, we don't know how you're going to keep everybody legal." Unquote. Well, the man from Chrysler was right. This would be a problem and continued to be a problem well after this article was written. However, this is one of the few times a magazine actually pointed out the cheating, which is one of the reasons I think it's the best road test out there. I know this still goes on, and it's almost never mentioned. Next, they needed to find a driver with no sponsorships or attachments to a U.S. automaker, yet one who would be recognized by U.S. auto enthusiasts and known as one of the top drivers in the world. They recruited a man named Maston Gregory. A lot of people don't know who he is now, but he was a big deal. He had been a Formula One driver and drove for Ford in the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1964. In fact, I just watched the new movie Ford versus Ferrari, and he was mentioned in it. Anyway, in 1966, he was unattached to any of the automakers, and best of all, had been living in Europe and had not seen any of the cars, so he could provide the most unbiased opinion possible. They equipped all the cars with Hurst wheels and Firestone tires to equalize the playing field in that regard, and they employed experts from Hurst and NHRA to perform displacement checks, compression checks, and to generally scrutinize the cars for unauthorized mods. Here's where the fun begins. Pontiac said they would be sending a GTO with the Royal Bobcat package. That's a dealer-installed performance package available at exactly one dealer, Royal Pontiac in Michigan. They decided to let the Bobcat GTO run because the mods are minor, thinner head gaskets, rejetted carb, things like that. All mods anybody could do in a weekend, and since it was a known quantity and it was technically available at a dealer, although only one, they let it slide. Interestingly, when the Pontiac showed up, it showed up on a trailer with a large team of technicians and a lot of spare parts and an entire second car, which was the clone of the first car. The car they sent had a 4-speed, tri-power, 355 gears along with the Royal Bobcat package. Basically, this was the ideal GTO for this contest. Now, Oldsmobile hired a racing driver named John Fitch. He was pretty famous at the time, and he set up their 442 for this event. He was a heavy hitter in racing. He won the Mille Miglia and the 12 Hours of Sebring. Now, John Fitch actually rented out Bridgehampton Racetrack to sort out the 442 for this event. Not quite sure what sort out means, but I figured that having a professional race driver set the car up specifically for the track on which the contest will take place is going to give it an advantage. I don't know what mods the Olds had, but I seriously doubt it was totally stock. The 442 they sent had a 4-speed, 355 gears, and a single 4-barrel carb. Interesting that they didn't use tri-power on it. Now, Buick responded to the car and driver request simply by saying they would show up and that their car would conform to the rules, and there was no further communication. Buick showed up with a Grand Sport with the optional Rochester carb, giving it 340 horsepower, a 2-speed automatic, and 336 rear axle ratio. Obviously, that 2-speed is going to hurt it a bit. The Chevelle SS396 was almost certainly dead stock. It was the 360 horsepower version with a 4-speed and 355 gears. Ford and Mercury brought out the heavy guns, meaning they bent the rules a lot more than the others. The Fairlane GTA was being prepared by Holman and Moody. Let me put this into perspective for you. In 1965, so just the previous year, and only by a matter of months, when the stock cars in NASCAR were actually based on stock vehicles, Holman and Moody cars won 48 of 55 Grand National races. So these guys knew how to win with Fords, they knew the cars, and they understood how to bend the rules in rather difficult to detect ways. The Fairlane GTA that showed up had a 390, a 3-speed automatic, a 3.89 to 1 rear axle ratio, and was not even close to stock. The car sat 1.5 inches lower than normal, sounded ferocious, and would rev to 6,500 RPM. A normal 390 in one of these cars is done by about 5,500. By the way, Holman and Moody figured prominently in the movie Ford vs. Ferrari. The Cyclone GT was prepared by Bud Moore, another legendary NASCAR tuner. The Cyclone showed up with the 390, a 4-speed, and 411 gears. It was modified in much the same way as the Fairlane, and as we'll see, it was quite a monster. In the View of Car and Driver editors, they had 3 cars which were stock, the Chevelle, the Grand Sport, and the 442, and 3 modified cars, the GTO, Fairlane, and Cyclone. It's my opinion that the 442 probably had a little extra love as well. After all, Olds did hire a famous racer who rented Bridgehampton. If he wasn't making changes to the car, what was he doing with it? At the drag strip, things got interesting very fast. Maston Gregory did not do the drag racing. That wasn't really his specialty. He needed to take time to learn the Bridgehampton racetrack, which he had never driven before. So let's start with the Comet. From the article, quote, "The Comet bordered on the ludicrous. It came off the line like a super stock, surging up on its haunches exactly like the specially modified NHRA stockers. Its engine was an ostensibly stock 390 cubic inch Ford, the same prosaic old workhouse that has loyally powered the Thunderbird for so many seasons. Anyone who knows this engine will tell you there isn't a 390 built that will turn more than 5,300 to 5,500 RPM in stock form, but the ones in our Comet and Fairlane would turn an effortless 6,500 RPM. Unquote. Not surprisingly, the Comet ran the quickest quarter mile of the day, 1398 at 103.8 miles per hour on street tires. That's really fast, and much faster than any other stock Comet GT tested in 1966. The Fairlane ran 14.26 at 99 miles per hour, about a full second faster than any other Fairlane GTA test. A Holman Moody rep admitted to altering the pump pressure to allow the transmission to shift faster. That was a common mod back in those days. In fact, it's common today. But it's clear that it had a lot more modifications than just that. Clearly, the Fairlane and Cyclone were modded, and modded by serious professionals. The GTO turned in a very fast time, largely due to its Royal Bobcat package. Other tests had shown Royal Bobcat GTOs running in the very low 14s, and that's what this one did. The GTO ran 14.05 at just over 105 miles per hour. That was the second quickest time of the day and the fastest trap speed. I should mention these are actual times, and this was done during the winter in New York, so the low temperatures increased the power a meaningful amount, making the times a little bit quicker than maybe would be normal. They did use expert drivers, and they made over 200 runs, so we really are seeing the best possible times for these cars, at least on street tires from the period. The Olds ran a very impressive 14.59 at 100.55 miles per hour. That's pretty much in harmony with other times from other sources for this car. The slowest car of the day, but still pretty fast, was the Buick Grand Sport. It ran 14.98 at 95.13 miles per hour. That might be the quickest time ever for a two-speed muscle car, a stock one. The Buick's Torquey 401, combined with the variable pitch transmission, allowed it to do pretty well. The second slowest time was the Chevelle's at 14.66 and 99.88 miles per hour. The Chevelle's valve lash wasn't adjusted correctly. The Hurst team adjusted it at the track, but the need to do that indicates to me that the car wasn't prepared properly. If the car was set up properly, I think it would have been quicker than the 442. And had Chevrolet sent the 375 horsepower version, it would have been the quickest overall. Of course, I'm just speculating there. So, what about the times around Bridgehampton's race course? This is important because this involves the whole car, power, shifting, cornering, and braking, everything. The fastest was the Cyclone at 2:05, 2 minutes and 5 seconds, 2 minutes and 5.8 seconds. It was smoking badly on deceleration, but Bud Moore's team said that was because the engine was set up a little loose, still within factory specs. That's interesting to me. Smoking on deceleration usually means oil is getting through the valve guides, and this to me is an indication they did work in this area. And that would involve removing the heads. You've got to remove the heads to remove the valves to hone out the valve guides to set it up a little loose. And I think it's a certainty that when they did that, they did a performance valve job, probably better valve springs, and a slightly hotter cam. That's what probably gave the engine its ability to rev to 6,500 RPM. However, during the event, the Comet's engine threw a rod, so they couldn't complete the braking test. Maston Gregory's opinion was that the Cyclone had a very harsh ride, but was set up well for lapping at Bridgehampton. Had a lot of power from 3,500 RPM up to 6,500 RPM, again indicative of valve work in a cam. It did suffer from axle tramp, and it was so bad that Maston Gregory had to keep the car in fourth gear for the entire lap, yet it still set the fastest time. That gives an indication of how well set up this car was. The 442 turned in the second fastest time at 2:06.0, so just 0.2 of a second behind the Comet. Maston Gregory said this was, quote, far and away the best handling car of the bunch, unquote. He gave the Olds a lot of praise, saying it was the only car in the group he genuinely enjoyed driving, and that he would have had the fastest lap time in it if he had had more practice with it. He also said it would be his choice for a transcontinental trip. High praise indeed. The GTO ran the course in 2:06.8. Maston Gregory felt that the GTO had the most power of all the cars in the test. However, he said the suspension was just too soft and that it tended to float and bounce and suffer from axle tramp. In short, it just wasn't set up well for the racetrack. The Fairlane and Chevelle both turned in 208.1. Mast and Gregory felt that the Chevelle had the best seating position, but like most of the other cars, the suspension was too soft. Interestingly, he commented that he didn't feel that the car had 360 horsepower, and that none of the cars here seemed to have the claimed amounts of power. I suspect that's because he had just come back from Europe and was used to a different ratings method. His comments on the Fairlane mostly involved the transmission. He really liked the C6 3-speed automatic, said it shifted better than he could, but as with most of the cars, felt the suspension let the car down, and seemed to think the Fairlane's suspension was the worst of the lot, probably because it was biased heavily towards drag racing. The Fairlane's engine, started to fail, and Gregory brought it in. It did have enough life left to limp through the brake test, but this shows how aggressively set up the two Fords were. Well, Ford products, the Ford and the Mercury. The Buick was just a bit behind the Fairlane and Chevelle at 208.5. Master Gregory liked the Buick. Of course, he felt it was too soft, but said it had the least power, and that the 2-speed was totally out of place here. However, he said he got to like it and thought it would be great for regular driving. Most importantly, he said he thought it was the only car that was driven from the factory to the event and was truly stock. That leaves the braking test, so here you go. The Buick does really well here, and the Comet is missing for the reasons we already discussed. The article concludes by saying that the man from Chrysler was right. In the case of the Fairlane and Cyclone, they didn't represent what an actual customer would find on the showroom floor. The GTO was a known quantity, but again, not typical of what a customer would find at the local dealer. The Chevelle was unprepared, the Buick wasn't properly equipped for the battle, the 442 was well set up and was the standout at the racetrack, came out very well. This article is a perfect example of why you can't just look at the specs at the end. If you did, you would think that the Cyclone GT will clobber an SS 396 in the quarter mile and at the track, but that's just not the case. The real story is quite a bit more complex. Now we have to deal with the Dodges and Plymouth for 66. They're still B-bodies, the same ones we had in 65, but with new sheet metal. In terms of performance, the Coronet, Charger, and Belvedere variants are all the same car, so let's dive right in with the 1966 Hemi Satellite. The very next month, Car and Driver tested the Hemi Satellite and started the article off by saying to Plymouth, "You should have been here last month. You would have taken home all the marbles, and without a specially prepared car, without towing it to the track, and without it blowing up." That's not an exact quote, but it's pretty close. The Hemi Satellite was fast, really fast. With a 4-speed and 354 gears, it ran the quarter mile in 13.8 seconds. Popular Hot Rodding ran one and got 13.25 at over 109 miles per hour, but I think that was on slicks. I'm not sure. In any case, the new street Hemi was the real deal. It was effectively the fastest of the true street muscle cars, and all Hemi cars came with upgraded brakes and suspension. In any speed contest, a Hemi Charger, Coronet, Satellite was likely to come out on top. One magazine said they expected a lot of GTOs to be found on the used car lots with the introduction of the street Hemi. However, that didn't happen. The Hemi cars for 1966 had some problems. First, they were expensive. That extra $800 to $1,000 made a relatively cheap Plymouth Satellite into an expensive car. Second, they were not branded as effectively as the cars from GM or Ford. If you had a Hemi Satellite or Charger, it looked just like the more mundane 318 cubic inch powered versions. I suppose that that's an advantage for some if you want a stealthy car, but it didn't help sales. Thus, they did not put GTOs or much of anything else onto the used lots. Most people wanting a performance Dodge or Plymouth bought it with the 325 horsepower 383. It's an excellent engine, and it was economical, meaning it didn't cost a lot to buy it. That put it a bit ahead of the automatic GM muscle cars in performance. If you wanted to compare 4-speed cars, The 383s were a bit behind the highest performing GM cars, but not much. For example, a 325 horsepower Satellite against a tri-power GTO's 360 isn't insurmountable. Mild mods will get the 383 right there, and with traction limits of the day, a good driver, different gear ratios, those things could make up the difference quite easily. So the 383s were a force to be reckoned with. Here's a chart with all the quarter mile times we went over today, plus I'll put in a few more. Just remember that the times from the March 66 article are absolute best cases for street tires, cold days, professional drivers, lightweight aftermarket wheels, and in at least 3 of the cases, specially prepared cars. Anyhow, have a great day, and I really look forward to reading your comments below.